Dying?
No,
Not afraid?
no,
Not afraid of the chair?
no.
How come?
Because I'm peaceful with myself,
Honest?
honest.
I never thought it would come to this, said Dalton Prejean, moments before his death in the electric chair. But for these young offenders, the point of no return had long passed. These were not hardened criminals, just kids, teenagers, who, in a tragic twist of fate, found themselves standing at the end of a long, unforgiving road. The question we must ask: when does justice cross the line into something far more final? Today, we're diving into real cases where young offenders were sentenced to the death penalty, their lives cut short by a system that often fails to account for youth, mental health, and the possibility of change. Among these stories is that of Dalton Prejean, who at just 17 years old was sentenced to death after killing a police officer. There's also Johnny Frank Garrett, whose troubled childhood led him to commit an unimaginable crime. These are not isolated cases. They represent a wider pattern of minors being held to adult standards of punishment with life-altering consequences. We'll also uncover the stories of others, each with their own tragic journey, questioning the fairness of the justice system when it comes to young offenders. These cases garnered attention, both in the media and in the courts, sparking debates that continue to this day. Were these children the true perpetrators of their actions, or were they victims of a broken system? Before we get started, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe to the channel, because in this video, we're going to explore more in-depth stories of crime, justice, and the gray areas in between. Here's a question for you. Have you ever questioned the death penalty? What happens when young offenders face consequences that seem too severe for their age? Let's talk about it in the comments. As we move forward, we'll break down each case, step by step. We'll uncover the human side of these crimes, what led these teens down this dark path, what their final moments were like, and how their stories challenge our understanding of justice. Stick with us to the end, because the twists in these cases might just surprise you. Dalton Prejean was born in 1960 in Louisiana, a state where the echoes of poverty and violence echoed through many homes. Dalton's childhood was anything but stable. Raised in a turbulent household, he was exposed to violent behavior from an early age. His parents struggled with their own issues, and Dalton, lacking proper guidance, found himself vulnerable to the harsh realities of his environment. There was little to no nurturing in his upbringing, which led him to adopt a hardened demeanor by the time he reached his teenage years. By 17, he was already involved in criminal activity, a path that would eventually lead him to his tragic fate. On July 2nd, 1977, Dalton and three friends were driving through Lafayette Parish when they were pulled over by Officer Donald Cleveland for a minor traffic violation. The stop quickly escalated after a heated exchange between Dalton and Officer Cleveland's brother, Joseph. Furious and upset by the way he was treated, Dalton, in a fit of rage, pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and shot Officer Cleveland twice, killing him instantly. The group fled the scene, but Dalton's escape was short-lived. Hours later, he was arrested and taken into custody. Despite his mental health struggles and his low IQ, Dalton was sentenced to death in 1978. The prosecution used his crime as a precedent to justify the death penalty for juvenile offenders, ignoring the circumstances of Dalton's troubled upbringing and emotional struggles. In his final moments, Dalton was offered a last meal, which he requested to be a seafood platter with an orange soda. When asked for his last words, he simply stated that nothing would be accomplished by his execution, but he found peace in the thought that his son would be able to rise above the legacy of violence he had left behind. Dalton Prejean was executed by electrocution on May 18, 1990. His story still raises an important question. Should a young offender, still in the process of growing and changing, face the ultimate punishment? Johnny Frank Garrett's early years were marked by neglect, abuse, and an environment that seemed to set him on a path of tragedy. Born on December 24, 1963 in Amarillo, Texas, Johnny's childhood was filled with physical violence, sexual abuse, and exposure to substances. His mother's struggles with addiction and the absence of a stable family foundation left Johnny vulnerable to a harsh world. By the time he was 17, Johnny had already exhibited clear signs of deep emotional and psychological trauma, his behavior shaped by the abuse he endured from a young age. In 1981, Johnny's troubled life took a dark turn when he brutally murdered Sister Tadia Benz, a 76-year-old nun, at a convent in Amarillo. The crime stunned the local community, as Sister Tadia was a beloved figure known for her charitable work. Johnny was arrested shortly after the murder, and the investigation revealed a young man who had suffered profoundly at the hands of others. Experts would later diagnose Johnny with multiple personality disorder, a condition believed to have stemmed from years of abuse and neglect. Despite the evidence of his unstable mental state, Johnny's defense, which could have highlighted his mental health struggles, was largely ignored during the trial. Instead, the jury convicted him of capital murder and sentenced him to death. Over the years, Johnny's case drew attention from around the world, with Pope John Paul II and various human rights organizations calling for clemency due to Johnny's age, mental health issues, and history of abuse. But these pleas were rejected. After years of legal battles, Johnny was executed by lethal injection on February 11, 1992. Johnny's final words were defiant. "I would like to thank my family for loving me and taking care of me. The rest of the world can kiss my ever-loving ass." His case remains a tragic reminder of the flaws in a justice system that failed to consider the profound impact of his childhood trauma. Charles Rumbaugh, born in 1958, was a product of an unstable and chaotic upbringing. Raised in an environment marked by neglect and violence, Rumbaugh's early life set the stage for a future filled with trouble. From a young age, he had run-ins with the law, showing signs of a young man headed down a dangerous path. Despite attempts to reform, Rumbaugh's behavior grew increasingly violent and criminal as he entered his teenage years. At the age of 17, Rumbaugh's criminal history escalated into something far more tragic. On April 4, 1975, he participated in a robbery at a jewelry store in Amarillo, Texas. During the heist, things took a fatal turn when Rumbaugh shot and killed the store owner, Michael Fillo, in cold blood. The crime was senseless, and Rumbaugh's actions sent shockwaves through the community. His involvement in the murder was clear, and after a brief escape from jail, he was apprehended and faced the full force of the law. Rumbaugh's trial was swift, and he was convicted of capital murder. His defense was weak and failed to fully address the underlying issues that may have contributed to his violent behavior. Issues like his troubled upbringing and the criminal history that had followed him throughout his adolescence. Despite these factors, the court found Rumbaugh guilty, and he was sentenced to death. On September 11, 1985, Charles Rumbaugh was executed by lethal injection. His final words were brief but poignant. "DJ Lori, Dr. Wheat, all I can say is goodbye." His execution was met with little public sympathy, though it sparked discussions about the role of childhood trauma and mental health in criminal behavior. Rumbaugh's case remains a point of reflection. Was the death penalty the right response for a young man whose troubled past may have contributed to his crime? Glenn McGinnis was born in 1970, and his early years were filled with turmoil. Raised in a family with few resources and minimal emotional support, McGinnis's upbringing was far from ideal. He became involved in petty crimes during his youth, and by the time he was an adult, his criminal behavior had escalated. The lack of a stable home environment and the influence of a troubled neighborhood led him down a path of violence and lawlessness. In 1990, McGinnis committed a senseless and violent crime that would end in tragedy. During a robbery at a dry cleaners in Conroe, Texas, McGinnis shot and killed Lita Wilkerson, an employee who had been working at the establishment. The murder was both brutal and unnecessary. The weapon, a .25 caliber pistol, was found in McGinnis's possession when he was arrested, leaving little room for doubt about his involvement. McGinnis had been arrested before for minor crimes, but this time the consequences were far more severe. The crime, its brutality, and the fact that a life was taken so carelessly led to McGinnis being charged with capital murder. His defense was sparse, and in 1992, after a quick trial, McGinnis was convicted and sentenced to death. On January 25, 2000, Glenn McGinnis was executed by lethal injection. His final moments were notably cold and detached. He made no request for a last meal and offered no last words. His lack of emotion during his execution raised questions about the emotional detachment that some individuals exhibit when faced with the ultimate punishment. Was McGinnis a product of his environment, or was his crime simply the result of an unfeeling nature? His execution left many wondering whether emotional detachment could be a sign of deeper psychological issues. Douglas Christopher Thomas's story is a tragic example of youthful passion spiraling into violence with irreversible consequences. Born in 1973, Thomas was a 17-year-old teenager struggling with the complexities of relationships, emotions, and the pressures of adolescence. His life took a violent turn due to his relationship with 14-year-old Jessica Wiseman. The two were deeply involved, but their relationship was disapproved of by Jessica's parents, Kathy and James Wiseman. Frustrated by their disapproval and eager to be together, Jessica and Douglas devised a plan to escape the boundaries set by her parents. On the night of November 3, 1990, armed with a shotgun, Douglas entered the Wiseman home, guided by Jessica. The night turned deadly when he shot and killed both of Jessica's parents in cold blood. The brutal act shocked the community, and the crime revealed the volatile mixture of youthful passion and poor decision-making. Douglas was arrested shortly after the murder, and his trial was swift. His defense team highlighted his age and mental instability, but these factors failed to sway the court. Despite being only 17 at the time of the crime and exhibiting signs of emotional turmoil, Thomas was convicted and sentenced to death. The case raised profound questions about the capacity of a teenager to fully understand the consequences of their actions, especially when driven by intense emotions and poor judgment. On January 10, 2000, Thomas was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Virginia. His last meal request was simple: fried chicken. Before his death, he expressed deep frustration with his fate, especially when comparing his sentence with Jessica's, who, as an accomplice, received only a 7-year sentence. His final words were tinged with regret. "I made the wrong decision, so I can't be mad at anyone but myself." Thomas's case serves as a stark reminder of the complexity of teenage behavior and the weight of life-altering decisions made at a young age. Reuben Montoya Cantu's case stands as one of the most controversial juvenile executions in Texas history, raising questions about justice, fairness, and the accuracy of the legal system. Born in 1976, Reuben's early life was marked by poverty and involvement in criminal behavior. Raised in a rough neighborhood, he struggled to escape the influence of gangs and violence, setting the stage for the crime that would define his fate. In 1984, at the age of 17, Reuben and an accomplice were involved in a robbery at a house under construction in San Antonio, Texas. During the crime, Pedro Gomez, a 30-year-old man, was killed, and another person, Juan Moreno, was severely injured. The robbery was brutal, but the case against Reuben was based largely on Moreno's identification of him as one of the attackers, despite a lack of physical evidence tying him directly to the crime. Despite doubts surrounding the case and the shaky testimony, Reuben was arrested, charged with capital murder, and sentenced to death in 1985. Over the years, questions about his innocence continued to emerge. Key aspects of the case, including discrepancies in witness testimonies, cast doubt on the conviction. Moreno, the surviving victim, initially identified Reuben but later recanted his statement, admitting that he may have been wrong in his identification. Additionally, another witness later came forward, stating that the shooter had very curly hair, which did not match Reuben's description. Despite these developments, the conviction stood, and Reuben was executed by lethal injection on August 24, 1993. In a tragic twist, his last meal request was denied, and he was not given the chance to speak before his execution. His case continued to haunt many who believed the justice system had failed to adequately investigate his innocence before taking such a drastic step. Years after his death, the controversy surrounding Reuben Montoya Cantu's case reignited, as questions about the fairness of his trial and his possible innocence lingered in the public conscience. Toronto Patterson's story is yet another tragic tale of a young life that spiraled into violence, leaving behind heartbreak and unanswered questions. Born in 1978, Patterson's early life was shaped by instability and a lack of support. Growing up in a difficult environment, he struggled with the pressures of his surroundings. As he reached his teenage years, Patterson became involved in criminal activity, a path that would ultimately lead him to commit a senseless murder. On June 6, 1995, Patterson entered the home of 47-year-old Kimberly Brewer in Texas. During the robbery, he shot and killed Kimberly in cold blood. After the murder, Patterson went on to steal items from her home, including valuables that he later attempted to sell. The crime was shocking for its brutality and lack of any discernible motive beyond the robbery. Despite his young age, he was just 17 at the time of the crime. Patterson was arrested, charged with capital murder, and sentenced to death. His trial was swift, and though there were efforts by his defense to highlight his youth and troubled background, the jury found him guilty and imposed the harshest of sentences. Patterson's case raised difficult questions about the appropriate punishment for juveniles who commit violent crimes. On August 28, 2002, Patterson was executed by lethal injection at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. The night before his execution, he was given his last meal request, which included 6 pieces of fried chicken, 4 jalapenos, and white cake with white icing. In his final moments, Patterson expressed both regret and guilt, acknowledging the pain he had caused. However, he also maintained that he didn't deserve to die for the crime, saying, "I'm sorry for the pain. I should be punished for the crime, but I don't think I should die for a crime I didn't commit." Patterson's execution left a lingering sense of unease. Was the death penalty the only appropriate sentence for a young man who had lived a life marked by hardship and violence? Napoleon Beasley's case is a stark example of the moral and legal complexities surrounding juvenile justice. Born in 1976, Beasley's early life was marked by instability and exposure to violence. At the age of 17, Beasley committed a brutal and premeditated crime that would ultimately lead to his death sentence. In 1994, Beasley, along with 2 accomplices, planned the robbery and murder of John Lux, a 63-year-old businessman. The crime was cold and calculated, with Beasley and his partners lying in wait for Lux to arrive home. After confronting Lux, Beasley shot and killed him, before fleeing the scene with his accomplices in the stolen vehicle. The murder was senseless, and the brutal nature of the crime shocked the community. Despite his age, Beasley was arrested and charged with capital murder. His trial quickly moved forward, and he was convicted, receiving a death sentence. The case raised important questions about the fairness of sentencing juveniles to death, as Beasley's age and troubled background were often overshadowed by the brutality of his crime. His conviction sparked debates on whether the juvenile justice system should treat young offenders with more leniency, especially considering the possibility of rehabilitation. On May 28, 2002, after years of appeals, Beasley was executed by lethal injection at the Walls Unit in Huntsville, Texas. Before his execution, Beasley was asked if he had any last words. Reflecting on the gravity of his actions, he said, "The act I committed to put me here was not just heinous, it was senseless. But the person that committed that act is no longer here. I am." Beasley's case continues to be a symbol of the complex ethical issues surrounding juvenile death sentences. Was his execution an act of justice, or was it a failure to account for his age, emotional development, and potential for change? His death leaves a lingering question about the fairness and humanity of executing minors. The cases of Dalton Prejean, Johnny Frank Garrett, and others leave us grappling with an uncomfortable but necessary question. When should a young offender be held fully accountable for their actions? These individuals, who were sentenced to death for crimes committed during their youth, are emblematic of a larger issue within the justice system: how we treat juvenile offenders and the factors that influence their behavior. In each of these cases, the young age of the offenders, their troubled upbringings, and the mental health challenges they faced were central to the story. While their crimes were undeniably violent and tragic, it is crucial to examine the circumstances surrounding their actions. Many of these juveniles had difficult childhoods, marked by abuse, neglect, or exposure to violence. They had not been given the same opportunities for growth, support, or rehabilitation as others their age. And yet the justice system often does not account for the full extent of their development or their potential for change. Research into adolescent brain development shows that the brain does not fully mature until the age of 25, particularly in areas related to impulse control, decision-making, and emotional regulation. This means that many young offenders may lack the full capacity to understand the consequences of their actions or to make sound judgments. Furthermore, juvenile offenders have a higher capacity for rehabilitation compared to adults, particularly when provided with proper support and treatment. This understanding played a pivotal role in the landmark Roper v. Simmons 2005 decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, which abolished the death penalty for juveniles. The court acknowledged that young people are still developing emotionally and cognitively, and therefore executing them for crimes committed as minors was not only unconstitutional, but morally unjustifiable. The emotional cost of juvenile executions extends beyond the victims and their families. It reaches into the lives of the offenders' families, who are left to grapple with the consequences of a death sentence, often for a child who was a product of circumstances beyond their control. It forces us to ask whether we should be so quick to end the life of a young person who is still in the process of developing, changing, and potentially finding redemption. Should the justice system focus more on rehabilitation, aiming to guide these young individuals toward better futures? Or should it continue to impose punishment that might be more appropriate for fully grown adults? This is a question that lingers, challenging us to reconsider how we define justice, especially for those who are still growing and evolving. What do you think about juvenile offenders facing the death penalty? Should young individuals still in the process of emotional and psychological development be held to the same standards as adults when it comes to the ultimate punishment? Is it possible for a teenager shaped by a difficult past to change and rehabilitate? Or should the consequences of their actions be absolute, regardless of age or circumstance? These are tough questions, and your thoughts are important. The cases we explored today illustrate the complex intersection of youth, crime, and justice, raising issues that demand careful reflection. In each case, the young offenders had their own personal struggles, from troubled upbringings to mental health challenges, yet they still face the death penalty for their crimes. So, what do you think? Can society find room for redemption in these cases? Or is the severity of the crime too much to overlook? Should young offenders be given a chance to rehabilitate? Or is the punishment justifiable based on the harm they caused? We want to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going and explore the complexities of juvenile justice together. If you're enjoying this deep dive into difficult subjects, don't forget to like and subscribe for more content on crime, justice, and the human stories behind the headlines. Your perspective could shed light on how we can better approach issues of crime, punishment, and compassion for those who make mistakes at a young age. In our next episode, we'll delve into even more tragic tales where justice and mercy collide, examining how the law has evolved when it comes to punishing young offenders. We'll explore cases where the legal system was forced to confront the complexity of juvenile crime, questioning whether the law has kept up with our growing understanding of adolescent development. As we unpack these stories, we'll ask tough questions. Were these young offenders truly beyond redemption, or did the system fail them at a critical time in their lives? Were they shaped by their environment, or were they simply products of their own choices? And as we look back at the decisions made, will we find more flaws in the system, or perhaps uncover examples where justice truly prevailed? We'll also explore how public perception and legal precedents have shifted over time, especially as societal views on punishment, rehabilitation, and second chances continue to evolve. Stay tuned as we uncover more layers of crime, punishment, and humanity. Each case reveals something new about how we view justice, mercy, and the capacity for change. If you've been following these stories, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Subscribe and be part of the conversation. You won't want to miss a single moment of this journey.